the title made a very big assumption, I realized, that you would be aware that the UK Web Archive, which is part of the British Library, was hit by a cyber attack. You might not be aware of that, so I need to make sure you are from the outset, because hopefully the rest of the presentation will make sense once you realize that detail. So prior to the cyber attack, we had a variety of systems running. We started, we collect, we preserve, we provide access to web archiving material, but we do this also on behalf of 6 legal deposit libraries, the three nations of England, Scotland and Wales, and the universities of Cambridge, Oxford and Trinity College Dublin. We've generally followed, we set this up and it started before me, started I believe around 2006 from predecessors who also no longer in the library and therefore sort of a bit of lost knowledge, but it followed what was at that time the best practice, what the people were testing on, very much an open source community-led activity as web archiving was in the early days. It also meant that all of those systems that we installed, configured, built, etc., were open source and they ran on Linux. But the British Library is not a Linux house. It is very unfamiliar with Linux, and therefore the UK Web Archive was very much a prototype or pilot that was, quite frankly, cobbled onto the side of the technology department, and, oops, be careful of that, falling off the table, the stage generally does disrupt your thinking. So it's very important to be aware that we sort of developed our solutions rather separately to the development patterns and the resources within the British Library. It was sort of an individually team-led activity. So prior to the cyber attack, as said, we did crawling, and we performed all of our crawling on site. We performed it ourselves. We weren't somebody who went out and sort of gained data from other sources, although obviously we also did so benefit from that. We, as I said, did that from late 2000s, and then the national legal deposit legislation, I'm going to vary off this because I'm going to a point. The legislation allowed us to sort of build up to running domain crawls as well. So our on-site crawling was both curator-led targeted sites that we chose to crawl, and also domain crawling, annual national domains crawled once a year. To buffer those, all the data coming in, we used a Gluster file system, which is an open source distributed file system, to sort of hold that data prior to it going into our preservation store. For that we had, in the very early days, we had a very early version of Hadoop, and we still have a very early version of Hadoop, but we did develop a second installation, which is now relatively up to date. We have about 2 petabytes of data in those 2 stores now. We also had a discovery and access solution. It used a variety of technologies. We used Solr for providing a full text discovery mechanism. And we started off, as in the early days, we used a static CDX file, and we used the Java-based Wayback Machine, but we evolved over time to using Outback CDX and PyWB. This amounts to, as well as us being outside of the technology department, or at least sort of developing and implementing our own solutions, we ended up having a variety of these popular open source products, but also a lot of in-house developed scripts that might be moving data from here to there, it might be performing indexing, And we had, over time, shifted a lot of our services into Docker as a container platform, and that was very beneficial, though we weren't particularly aware of that benefit at this time. So the cyber attack happened in 2 years ago, in October, the last weekend of October, and immediately the whole of the British Library seemed to come into work on the Monday. The cyber attack happened over the weekend, and you can imagine very little worked, including communications. So very few people worked out what had happened. But eventually, the messages came around, and although the attack happened over the weekend, on Monday morning, the web archiving team sort of gathered on site and basically turned off every one of our servers. We had at the time over 200 servers, including physical and virtual machines, and the impact to the library was generally perceived to be attack on both our personal data and on our virtual machine networks. It wasn't identified that we had infiltration in other systems. But we very quickly shut everything down. And because we had already Dockerized our systems, our frequent crawl and separately our domain crawl both operated in a Dockerized environment. And fortunately, as there was a slide previously that mentioned COVID, one of the benefits of COVID is that the British Library, at that time, everything went remote, and everybody was sort of dialing in, etc., and therefore the requirement to perform a domain crawl from the British Library infrastructure was deemed not appropriate. So we moved that Dockerized system for the domain crawl onto AWS. We needed to do very little to move our existing, the activity that was going for the frequent crawling onto AWS, and that really helped us. We were up and running on AWS doing our frequent crawling within a week. However, since then, the British Library has entirely overhauled its technical infrastructure, but also its thinking. All processes have changed. There hasn't been anything untouched, which I'm jumping ahead. Everything now has to be secure by design, and the library was previously in consideration of its strategy towards a cloud platform, and now we have very much a cloud-first intention. And you can imagine that's a challenge for a large amount of data like a web archive would have. So we've so far only been able to restart a few of our 200-odd servers, literally a handful. I think the most we're actually allowed to start at any one time is 10, due to the concerns of the library of supporting systems at the moment. Because everything has been examined and assessed, it goes down to the power supplies, it goes down to access to rooms, all sorts of things. And therefore, we've been able to perform a test on our Hadoop cluster, on the newer one of the two, and we believe there is no evidence of infiltration of the cyber attack on that data, but we have not done that at a scale. So what do we learn from the cyber attack? Well, specifically, this is lessons learned from the library's point of view. Such an event impacts every part of the business. Every part of the business. It either attacks systems that are technical in nature, and therefore those services are offline, impacting the audiences, but also impacting all internal processes. And it impacts every team that doesn't use a technical system, because all of the systems they rely on, or the other teams that they rely on, just cannot go about their work. And so it has been incredibly difficult to start processes again because of the reliance on some bit of technology in that chain. To bring anything back, anything back. Every part of that process has to be reviewed and revised. There is, absolutely, as it says there, no stone left unturned. The approach now has become, as said, security first, for security by design, which means that everything has to be assessed and reviewed, brought up to date, challenged whether or not it's meeting principles, best practices, the process, and that is every single part of the business. And therefore, you can imagine this, the amount of impact here is just enormous. The change of the business culture has changed. The previous, when we were a pilot project, because we weren't embedded essentially within the technology department, we weren't beholden to their practices or their processes. I'm sure we should have been, but we were developing what we thought was the best way of developing web archiving. And sadly, we weren't thinking of that from a security point of view. And the culture change is enormous, so it has impacted every single team. But all of those things that you might think of in technology or doing development, but also business as usual stops. The impact, and as you can see, I'm reinforcing and repeating, the impact of the business is huge. And the recovery is a huge logistical challenge to the business. You cannot underestimate that. I think that, yeah, that's my sort of point. The extent of the attack is organizational, it's institutional, it's across every part of the business is being reviewed and considered. So the UK Web Archive, the plan is basically recover the data without a data store, which we have in Hadoop. We have no way of providing access, and of course we have no way to store new data, so we have to recover the data first. We are now required to move all data onto the new Hadoop cluster, but at the same time, sorry, I jumped ahead one there. At the same time, all of the machines in that cluster have to be updated to the latest bit of software at an operating system level. And of course, we don't have spare machines hanging around to hold that size of data, so we can do this. So we're having to do this on the fly, carefully making sure that we don't lose any data during the process. Fortunately, literally a month, I think it was a month and a half before the cyber attack happened, we had completed an archiving process that created a backup of about 90% of our data, 90% plus, of our data that was physically shipped up to the National Library of Scotland, which we're very grateful to have an off-site copy of our data. Oops, wrong button. We are, because of that 90%, we're now very focused on when the Hadoop cluster comes back, and that includes when it is allowed to be connected to a network, because all of this currently is being literally air-gapped from any activity that the library is involved in. When we are back up and running, we want to complete the remaining data up to the National Library of Scotland to make sure we have an off-site copy. I think that has become enormously clear as the highest priority we have is the data. And we would like to create that mechanism as a process that happens automatically and consistently and has a mechanism that asserts that it is successful and complete. Once providing that, we also seek to return an access solution, very simple one, without a discovery mechanism of a full text. Just the audience would provide I'm interested in this website, and they would then get presented of the data. We provided that in the old days to the general public over the internet and to the legal deposit libraries. The legal deposit libraries, the 6 libraries around the UK, have unlimited access where there is a restricted amount of data available for the public. Having tried to do that, when we've got that far, we also want to start crawling again. However, crawling means gathering data from the internet. The library is now very concerned about any data coming from anywhere that it hasn't vetted. So, fortunately, the library has recognized that it needs an institutionally wide solution for any data coming in. But you could appreciate with every project the library does now being reviewed and considered, the deadline for this is a bit unclear. So we hope to try and remove as much as we can of the issues that we bring to the table, but it is still going to be a problem. And as mentioned in the previous presentation about viruses, we also use ClamAV, and we do that on scanning as the data is coming in. But I think we're also going to have to provide a solution, an opportunity for the library to assess how well would they think we have done, because one of the big fallouts of this is a concern about is everybody doing the right thing in the whole process. When we have an ingest solution available, we would like to retrieve the data from AWS, and we would like to restart our on-site crawling systems. And as I said, all of our systems have to be security hardened. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm skipping ahead. So the lessons learning specifically for web archiving, and I hope I have time to show you this because I think this is important for you all to appreciate. Be aware of what is critical in your systems for web archiving. We do three things. We collect, we preserve, and we provide access. But to some extent, the access can wait. You have to continue crawling, and we were lucky that we had AWS available for that as a previously set up solution. But our data really needed to be secure and safe and known to be safe. And that last detail is important. Know why you have got the right data, that nothing has happened to it. If you suspected something had happened to it, how would you prove it? Absolutely, obviously, ensure you have a backup. It's been an enormous fight in the library to try and convince the library of the necessity to have a backup. 2 petabytes is a significant amount of size and a concern. But also keep a trusted manifest so you know your data is correct and you can approve that at a later date. And focus on your crawling. You're losing data if you don't do that at the time, and it's very easy with all of these events going on to not focus on that. It's been a battle to transition to the new world, essentially what we are thinking of doing. It still continues 18 months after the event. The big issue is the library has effectively lost trust in every one of its teams, not individually, but they want to see evidence of everything now being secure. And I think that for the audience, if you were hit by a cyber attack, your disaster recovery shouldn't focus on disaster recovery for the web archive exclusively. You need to consider the impact of the library, your institution being attacked, and what that will do to all systems, because you are dependent on so many. Thank you very much.